Okay, so we'll begin a new section, moving on from the hindrances in the fourth Satipatthana to some reflections regarding the five khandas, or the five aggregates, kind of following sequentially in the way it's presented in the fourth Satipatthana. Now I thought I'd just start with a bit of a overview or discussion of the five khandas as Bhikkhu Analayo presents it in his book Satipatthana. And I'll read the first several pages of chapter 10, which starts on page 201 in his book. And read a few pages from that as an introduction. So first, starting with a translation from the Satipatthana, exactly the paragraph that describes contemplation of the five khandas, or the five aggregates. He knows, quote, such is material form, such its arising, such its passing away, such is feeling, such its arising, such its passing away. Such is cognition, such as its arising, such its passing away. Cognition is his translation of sanya, more commonly seen as perception. Such are volitions, such their arising, such their passing away. Such is consciousness, such its arising, such its passing away. Clearly recognizing and understanding the five aggregates is of considerable importance, since without fully understanding them and developing detachment from them, it will not be possible to gain complete freedom from dukkha. Indeed, detachment and dispassion regarding these five aspects of subjective personality leads directly to realization. The discourses and the verses composed by awakened monks and nuns record numerous cases where a penetrative understanding of the true nature of the five aggregates culminated in full awakening. These instances highlight the outstanding potential of this particular Satipatthana contemplation. These five aggregates are often referred to in the discourses as the five aggregates of clinging, Panchupadana Khanda, which you'll recognize from our morning chanting, a salutation of the Triple Gem. In this context, aggregate, khanda, is an umbrella term for all possible instances of each category, whether past, present, or future, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, near or far. The qualification clinging, upadana, refers to desire and attachment in regard to these aggregates. Such desire and attachment in relation to the aggregates is the root cause for the arising of dukkha. So that word that you hear often in our chanting, panchupadana khanda. Pancha is five, upadana means clinging, khanda is the aggregates. So the five aggregates as affected by clinging. The sequence of these five aggregates leads from the gross physical body to increasingly subtle mental aspects. The first of the aggregates, material form, rupa, is usually defined in the discourses in terms of the four elementary qualities of matter: earth, fire, air, water. A discourse in the Khanda Samyutta explains that material form, rupa, refers to whatever is affected, rupati, by external conditions such as cold and heat, hunger and thirst, mosquitoes and snakes, emphasizing the subjective experience of rupa as a central aspect of this aggregate. Next in the sequence of the aggregates come feeling, vedana, and cognition, sanya, which represent the affective and the cognitive aspects of experience. In the context of the process of perception, cognition, sanya, is closely related to the arising of feeling, both dependent on stimulation through the six senses by way of contact, phassa. So that's often, you'll hear it often said that, and it's described like this in some of the suttas, that perception and feeling are conjoined, not disjoined, so that they come together in any moment of contact with the sense space. Perception and feeling arise together often, or fairly close with each other. The standard presentations in the discourses relate feeling to the sense organ, but cognition to the respective sense object. This indicates that feelings, which are pleasant, painful, or neutral, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, this indicates that feelings are predominantly related to the subjective repercussions of an experience, while cognitions, or perceptions, are more concerned with the features of the respective external object. That is, feelings provide the how, and cognitions the what of experience. To speak of a cognition of an object refers to the act of identifying raw sensory data with the help of concepts or labels, such as when one sees a colored object and one recognizes it as yellow, red, or white, etc. Cognition to some extent involves the faculty of memory, which furnishes the conceptual labels used for recognition. The fourth aggregate comprises volitions, or sankhara, representing the conative aspects of the mind. Conative meaning like purposeful or intentional aspects of the mind. These volitions or intentions correspond to the reactive or purposive aspect of the mind, that which reacts to things, or their potentiality. The aggregate of volitions and intentions interacts with each of the aggregates and has a conditioning effect upon them. In the subsequent developments of a Buddhist philosophy, the meaning of this term expanded until it came to include a wide range of mental factors. So as he says there, sankhara is a very, very broad term these days, referring to sometimes something very broad, like basically anything in the conditioned realm, to something more narrow, such as like mental volitions, mental inclinations that have the factor of intention with them. The fifth aggregate is consciousness, vijnana. Although at times the discourses use consciousness or vijnana to represent mind in general, in the context of the aggregate classification, it refers to being conscious of something. This act of being conscious is most prominently responsible for providing a sense of subjective cohesiveness, for the notion of a substantial I behind experience. Consciousness depends on the various features of experience supplied by name and form, nama rupa, just as name and form in turn depend on consciousness as their point of reference. This conditional interrelationship creates the world of experience, with consciousness being aware of phenomena that are being modified and presented to it by way of name and form, nama rupa. So sometimes you'll see him describe that nama rupa and consciousness are like two bundles of reeds that are leaning on each other and supporting each other. You take one away, the other one falls away. To provide a practical illustration of the five aggregates, during the present act of reading, for example, consciousness is aware of each word through the physical sense door of the eye. Cognition understands the meaning of each word, while feelings are responsible for the affective mood. Whether one feels positive, negative, or neutral about this particular piece of information. Because of volition, one either reads on or stops to consider a passage in more depth, or even refers to a footnote. The discourses describe the characteristic features of these five aggregates with a set of similes. These compare material form to the insubstantial nature of a lump of foam carried away by a river, feelings to the impermanent bubbles that form on the surface of water during rain, cognition to the illusory nature of a mirage, volitions to the essenceless nature of a plantain tree, because it has no heartwood, and consciousness to the deceptive performance of a magician. Ajahn Chunda is going to be reading that sutta in more detail in one of his readings. This set of similes points to central characteristics that need to be understood with regard to each aggregate. In the case of material form, contemplating its unattractive and insubstantial nature corrects mistaken notions of substantiality and beauty. Concerning feelings, awareness of their impermanent nature counteracts the tendency to search for pleasure through feelings. With regard to cognition, awareness of its deluding activity uncovers the tendency to project one's own values and one's own value judgments onto external phenomena as if these were qualities of the outside objects. With volitions, insight into their selfless nature corrects the mistaken notion that willpower is the expression of a substantial self. And I think that's a really important point, because sometimes it's easier for us to see the kind of nature of not self in regard to something like the body, but then you have this sense of an intention coming up, a mental intention to do something, and that actual quality of intention feels like me very strongly. There is something in here that's arising due to an independent agent willing it to arise. It's a very strong conditioning aspect of the sense of self. Regarding consciousness, understanding its deceptive performance counterbalances the sense of cohesiveness and substantiality it tends to give to what, in reality, is a patchwork of impermanent and conditioned phenomena. Okay, so I'll stop there from this particular source. Just gives a bit of an introduction as to the five aggregates and something of their quality and how they relate to each other. And now I will read a sutta from the Khanda Samyutta in Samyutta Nikaya, the Connected Discourses of the Buddha. This is the Khanda Samyutta, a whole collection of teachings of suttas that relate to the five khandas. And this is Khanda Samyutta 2285. It's entitled Yamaka. Before I start, could somebody hand me volume 2 of one of the chanting books? Because I know there's a reference to that in here. Thanks, Drew. Okay, starting with the sutta. On one occasion, the Venerable Sariputta was dwelling at Sawati in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Now on that occasion, the following pernicious view had arisen in a bhikkhu named Yamaka. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, the bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death. And I'm going to read the footnote with that. On that introductory statement of Yamaka. His position is not quite the same as that of the common annihilationist, since he does not hold that all beings are annihilated at death. He seems to hold an eternalist view in regard to unenlightened beings, since they have a lasting self which transmigrates, and annihilationism in regard to the Arahant, since he utterly perishes at death. So that's his. He's got a partial annihilationist, partial eternalist view. The two extremes of views. A number of bhikkhus heard that such a pernicious view had arisen in the bhikkhu Yamaka. Then they approached the Venerable Yamaka and exchanged greetings with him, after which they sat down to one side and said to him, "Is it true, friend Yamaka, that such a pernicious view as this has arisen in you? As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, a bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death." "Exactly so, friends. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, a bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death." "Friend Yamaka, do not speak thus. Do not misrepresent the Blessed One. It is not good to misrepresent the Blessed One. The Blessed One would not speak thus. A bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death." Yet, although he was admonished by the bhikkhus in this way, the Venerable Yamaka still obstinately grasped that pernicious view and adhered to it, and declared, "As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, a bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death." Since those bhikkhus were unable to detach the Venerable Yamaka from that pernicious view, they rose from their seats, approached the Venerable Sariputta, and told him all that had occurred, adding, "It would be good if the Venerable Sariputta would approach the bhikkhu Yamaka out of compassion for him." Then Venerable Sariputta consented by silence. Then in the evening the Venerable Sariputta emerged from seclusion. He approached the Venerable Yamaka and exchanged greetings with him, after which he sat down to one side and said to him, "Is it true, friend Yamaka, that such a pernicious view as this has arisen in you? As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, a bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death." "Exactly so, friend." "What do you think, friend Yamaka? Is form permanent or impermanent?" "Impermanent, friend." "But is that which is impermanent painful or pleasurable?" "Painful, friend." "But is it fit to consider that which is impermanent, painful, of a nature to change, as this is mine, I am this is myself?" "It is not, friend." "What do you think? Do you regard feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness as permanent or impermanent?" And he goes through the whole sequence of the Anatalakkhana Sutta, which I just read the first one of, so going through that whole sequence. And then he says, "No, friend," and through the formula there. And then he proceeds, Venerable Sariputta proceeds on with the next line of questioning. "What do you think, friend Yamaka? Do you regard form as the Tathagata?" "No, friend." "Do you regard feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness as the Tathagata?" "No, friend." "What do you think, friend Yamaka? Do you regard the Tathagata as in form?" And by the way, for those of you who may not know, Tathagata is just another epithet or word for the Buddha. "No, friend." "Do you regard the Tathagata as apart from form?" "No, friend." "Do you regard the Tathagata as in feeling, as apart from feeling, as in perception, as apart from perception, as in volitional formations, as apart from volitional formations, as in consciousness, as apart from consciousness?" "No, friend." "What do you think, friend Yamaka? Do you regard form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness taken together as the Tathagata?" "No, friend." "What do you think, friend Yamaka? Do you regard the Tathagata as one who is without form, without feeling, without perception, without volitional formations, without consciousness?" "No, friend." "But friend, when the Tathagata is when the Tathagata is not apprehended by you as real and actual here in this very life, is it fitting for you to declare, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, a bhikkhu whose taints are destroyed is annihilated and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death? Formerly, friend Sariputta, when I was ignorant, I did hold that pernicious view. But now that I have heard this Dhamma teaching of the Venerable Sariputta, I have abandoned that pernicious view and have made the breakthrough to the Dhamma, meaning stream entry. If, friend Yamaka, they were to ask you, friend Yamaka, when a bhikkhu is an arahant, one whose taints are destroyed, what happens to him with the breakup of the body, after death? Being asked thus, what would you answer? If they were to ask me this, friend, I would answer this. Friends, form is impermanent. What is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering has ceased and passed away. Feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness is impermanent. What is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering has ceased and passed away. Being asked thus, friend, I would answer in such a way. Good, friend Yamaka. Now, friend Yamaka, I will make up a simile for you in order to convey this same meaning even more clearly. Suppose, friend Yamaka, there was a householder or a householder's son, a rich man with much wealth and property protected by a bodyguard. Then some man would appear who wanted to ruin him, to harm him, to endanger him, to take his life. It would occur to that man, this householder or householder's son is a rich man with much wealth and property, protected by a bodyguard. It won't be easy to take his life by force. Let me get close to him and then take his life. Then he would approach that householder or householder's son and say to him, I would serve you, sir. Then the householder or householder's son would appoint him as a servant. The man would serve him, rising up before him, retiring after him, doing whatever he wants, agreeable in his conduct, endearing in his speech. The householder or householder's son would consider him a friend, a bosom friend, and he would place trust in him. But when the man becomes aware that the householder or householder's son has placed trust in him, then, finding him alone, he would take his life with a sharp knife. What do you think, friend Yamaka, when that man had approached the householder or householder's son and said to him, I would serve you, sir? Wasn't he a murderer even then, though the other did not recognize him as my murderer? And when the man was serving him, rising up before him, retiring after him, doing whatever he wants, agreeable in his conduct, endearing in his speech, wasn't he a murderer then, too, though the other did not recognize him as my murderer? And when the man came upon him while he was alone and took his life with a sharp knife, wasn't he a murderer then, too, though the other did not recognize him as my murderer? Yes, friend. So too, friend Yamaka, the uninstructed worldling, who is not a seer of the noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, who is not a seer of superior persons and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. He regards feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. He does not understand as it really is impermanent form as impermanent form, impermanent feeling as impermanent feeling, impermanent perception as impermanent perception, impermanent volitional formations as impermanent volitional formations, impermanent consciousness as impermanent consciousness. He does not understand as it really is painful form as painful form, painful feeling as painful feeling, painful perception as painful perception, painful volitional formations as painful volitional formations, painful consciousness as painful consciousness. He does not understand as it really is selfless form as selfless form, selfless feeling as selfless feeling, selfless perception as selfless perception. Selfless volitional formations as selfless volitional formations. Selfless consciousness as selfless consciousness. He does not understand as it really is conditioned form as conditioned form, conditioned feeling as conditioned feeling, conditioned perception as conditioned perception, conditioned volitional formations as conditioned volitional formations, conditioned consciousness as conditioned consciousness. He does not understand as it really is murderous form as murderous form, murderous feeling as murderous feeling, murderous perception as murderous perception, murderous volitional formations as murderous volitional formations, murderous consciousness as murderous consciousness. He becomes engaged with form, clings to it, and takes a stand upon it as myself. He becomes engaged with feeling, with perception, with volitional formations, with consciousness, clings to it, and takes a stand upon it as myself. These same five aggregates of clinging, to which he becomes engaged and to which he clings, lead to his harm and suffering for a long time. But friend, the instructed noble disciple, who is a seer of the noble ones, does not regard form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. He does not regard feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness. He understands as it really is impermanent form as impermanent form, etc., impermanent consciousness as impermanent consciousness. He understands as it really is painful form as painful form, painful consciousness as painful consciousness. He understands as it really is selfless form as selfless form, selfless consciousness as selfless consciousness. He understands as it really is conditioned form as conditioned form, conditioned consciousness as conditioned consciousness. He understands as it really is murderous form as murderous form, murderous consciousness as murderous consciousness. He does not become engaged with form, cling to it, and take a stand upon it as myself. He does not become engaged with feeling, with perception, with volitional formations, with consciousness, cling to it, and take a stand upon it as myself. These same five aggregates of clinging, to which he does not become engaged and to which he does not cling, lead to his welfare and happiness for a long time. So it is, friend Sariputta, for those venerable ones who have such compassionate and benevolent brothers in the holy life to admonish and instruct them. And now that I have heard this Dhamma teaching of the Venerable Sariputta, my mind is liberated from the taints by non-clinging. So he became an arahant. This is what the Venerable Sariputta said. Elated, the Venerable Yamaka delighted in the Venerable Sariputta's statement. So that's a very wonderful sutta, pointing to many, many different aspects of the contemplation of the five khandas. One of them being that the panchupadana khanda are the five aggregates as affected by clinging, but there are still the five aggregates not affected by clinging when one makes the breakthrough and one understands that deeply. So one is not annihilating the five khandas, but one is just removing the clinging to them, which is what is the root cause of identity view and suffering. So they become just the five aggregates. So that's, and then it's just like, just really pounds it in with Venerable Yamaka going through point by point about the nature of the five khandas being impermanent, unsatisfactory, and related to a perception of self in many ways. And then the great simile of the man who comes and endears himself to the householder, the wealthy householder, gains his trust, gets up before him, gets up or retires after him, and really just becomes something that's stable, seemingly stable and predictable, and something one can depend on, and then turns around and betrays him in a moment of inattention, and how that's such a great simile of the five khandas that we come to assume a relationship with them as me or mine or myself, and we kind of just don't think about it too much and rely on it and trust that relationship with a notion of self. And then in the end, the five khandas betray us. At the time of death, they disappear, they disintegrate, they depart. And if we've not removed our attachment to them, then there is suffering. So I think that's a really very, very clear teaching that points to a good reason to really take up the contemplation of the five khandas, and then, as Bhikkhu Analayo noted, it can take us to full liberation. So, any comments or questions or thoughts, reflections on either of these readings?
So it's a brilliant sutta. I often also think about how we often think about having realizations or insights as like coming through our meditative experience. But in this way, it's like someone's directly talking to him. And it happens again and again in the suttas where somebody becomes a stream enter, there's an arahant, and they're just being spoken to by an arahant, by somebody who's realized. They realize a full way, are basically brought into the process of it like that close, even though you had pernicious or wrong view, right from the get-go. He was stating wrong view, bringing it up, and then he must have just been teetering, to be able to brought right out of that, just through the speaking. That's the condition for stream entry actually is the voice of another. Mm-hmm. And so there it is, the voice of another, who brings him to that. So beautiful.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent point. That's another, really pronounced attribute of this sutta, is this pointing just that out, that as you said, we somehow maybe have this expectation that awakening is going to be happening when you're in a deep state of absorption or in some deep meditative state, but actually it's when the mind is clear and balanced and listening with clear comprehension and is in a reflective mode, that one can be drawn in through the teaching, development of insight into realization. It's not something you kind of, put your mind in the most absolutely, totally, completely refined, non-responsive, blissful state, and then you kind of slide into nibbana. It's, there's a reflective process that is part and parcel of it all.
I have even heard that it's been argued that there's a at the end of several suttas there's a point where often whether it's a monastic or lay person is listening, they say like a bunch of these metaphors, like you've turned over what has been used, turned over what has been laid down, all these things, and that's actually indicating that they become stream enters. And then they say, I'm busy and I have much to do. But like that, it was possibly common to be hearing the word straight directly from an arahant who could actually bring one into a sense of like, oh right, I'm thinking of it, I'm really getting this all wrong. And then they get it. I remember Ajahn saying once, like, talking about a sutta, I think it was the fire ceremony, there's, I think, 500 arahants, 1,000 arahants, and he says, I have to admit, I too would like to be able to even just bring one person to, after giving a Dhamma talk to, brought one person to awakening. So it's quite powerful in that aspect.
Very powerful.
I did, one thing that I thought of that was interesting is the guy I not thought of before is when he says, wouldn't you say he's a murderer even though, at this point, he's being trusted, he's doing all these things, but he's still a murderer,
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I really love that metaphor, but actually it's not true. In the exact simile, and that's why it's a simile, but in the exact simile, a murderer is not a murderer until they actually do what they do, because you can always turn back. And the khandas don't really turn back. They're, they don't have, we can turn back on them, we can kind of be not affected by the clinging, but in the end they're always betraying us if we are moving in that direction. Whereas like a murderer isn't necessarily going to do that. But they have the potential.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what more that signifies to me is like the aggregates always have the potential for being this when we are affected by clinging around them. And we shouldn't ever trust them because of that potential. Just like we wouldn't trust somebody kept saying, well, he told me he's going to murder you and he's interested in it. You shouldn't think, no, he's a nice guy, you don't know what you're talking about. Be careful. But it is a powerful, I really enjoy the thought of it as like these things that we put so much trust in are that dangerous.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
Yeah. The other kind of little point of logic that Venerable Sariputta makes that will appear in another reading that I'll do in a few days. It's just a kind of a great way of when people are wondering what happens to an enlightened being or the Tathagata after death, that Sariputta and then the Buddha also in other teachings brings the person through to trying to identify the Tathagata in some way or another in this very life through this whole questioning process of impermanence and dukkha and not self, and they come to the conclusion that you can't find a substantial essence that is permanent in somebody while they're alive, and so that kind of makes the question what happens to them after death a moot point, by saying but friend, when the Tathagata is not apprehended by you as real and actual here in this very life, is it fitting for you to declare, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, a bhikkhu's taints are destroyed, is annihilated, and perishes with the breakup of the body and does not exist after death? So sort of like if you can't identify the Buddha right here and now, what's the point of even asking about any, suggestion of existence or non-existence after death?
So I kind of have a question. It's not fully formulated, but is he then basing the identity of non-enlightened beings on the fact that they're clinging to the aggregates, right, or the khandas, that they're clinging, and that it's perpetuating, that clinging is perpetuating this existence?
It's perpetuating the view or the perception of identity, of existence, that clinging to anyone or all of, or some combination of the five khandas, is what forms the basis for that perception or that view of having a substantial identity. It doesn't mean that there, that there isn't a substantial identity, but it provides a basis for that experience or that perception of that.
Is that like the dualism of eternalism and annihilation is like they're both kind of delusions in that sense? That it's something that's viewed as perpetuated?
Yeah, I would say so. There's another great sutta which actually I'll probably read in a few days as well, that kind of points that out, that those views, eternalism, annihilationism, or sometimes as it's referred to as existence and non-existence, as similar, as synonyms to that. That those are two extremes, and that they are both based on mistaken assumptions and mistaken perceptions, and that essentially all that arises is just dukkha arising. All that ceases is just dukkha ceasing, as pointed out. And then he goes through a whole sequence of dependent origination and that kind of stuff. That's a wonderful sutta which we'll touch base on later. But yes, that's that what you said seems appropriate. That clinging to the khandas in any way whatsoever as a form of self is what leads to those viewpoints, those extremes.
I think there's just where the Buddha is asking about what he is, and it's like, are you a god? And then they ask, are you a human being? And you kind of expect him to go, yeah, I'm just a regular guy. And he's like, no. Wow.
Well, what are you?
You're supposed to be a little humble, and what are you? And he in essence, he says that because this clinging is gone and he will not take rebirth, that is what defines what a human being is what I remember. So like what we are defined as human beings are those who have this clinging to the five aggregates, and that we will take them up again when we die. And for a being who doesn't do that, they no longer fulfill the definition of what a human being is. So it's like that's our sort of, that continuation in samsara is what sort of defines us.
You didn't give the answer to what are you then? What he said.
I think he says he's not.
He says, I am awake.
Oh, he's awake. That's right.
Yeah. What are you? I am awake.
Yeah, he's awake. Which is interesting because it's like, again, underlining that perception of like, you must be something, something. And he doesn't get to the physical or materiality or physical, what somebody keeps trying to define him as.
He just describes his realization.
Yeah, it's like, this is what it is. So I mean, that's
he's not saying that's what he is,
yeah,
in quotes either, but that's describing the quality of his mind.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's no other questions or comments, it's 10:30. Get ready for the meal.